Hello folks, welcome back. This is Chris in Central Pennsylvania. South Africa's Social Research Foundation just released a survey of what would happen should there be a vote of no confidence against South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa. Remember that in South Africa, folks, people don't vote for the president. Parliament votes because it's disguised as a republic, but much more along the lines of a parliamentary system with a president with executive powers who comes out of the parliament. In other countries, we call that a chancellor or a prime minister. Anyway, so South Africa, what would happen if Ramaphosa had a vote of no confidence? This becomes increasingly a prospect given the dispute within the so-called Government of National Unity with the Democratic Alliance not in accord with what the African National Congress wants to do. And it hardly comes as a surprise. It's fascinating to see the Patriotic Alliance play both sides of the fence. But the Patriotic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, the UDM, the Democratic Alliance, all were left in the dark when President Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Without Compensation Act, pretending to do so in Davos when he actually signed it on December 20th. Just a big show for the cameras there at Davos. Actually signed this piece of legislation which is unconstitutional. It violates Section 25 of South Africa's Constitution by providing nil or zero compensation for folks when land is confiscated. Now that's illegal according to the Constitution, but hey, I guess we'll have to wait for a court challenge. But in the meantime, there is discord in the so-called Government of National Unity. There's discord in South Africa. What happens? What comes next? Well, according to this survey, should there be a vote of no confidence, which could happen. After all, the ANC needed the 87 votes from the Democratic Alliance to get over the top. But if that were to happen, then Ramaphosa would be out. It's a simple vote of no confidence. They would likely have an election shortly after that. And who would get the most votes? Well, according to the Social Research Foundation, based on 1,004 registered voters across South Africa, demographically split amongst different groups and different percentiles of income brackets, the ANC would be out. They would get just 20% of the vote. 20%. That's down from the 40.18% which they achieved in the elections of May 29, 2024. So what comes next, folks? What comes next? Fascinating, is it not? What do you think? Well, I have this much to say. That's a hypothetical, and we can't necessarily deal in hypotheticals, can we now? So in this hypothetical situation, the ruling African National Congress, which is now the plurality party, would drop from 40 to 20% of the popular vote. That remains to be seen if that's actually the case, but the vote is based on the African National Congress led by someone other than Cyril Ramaphosa, which makes it quite clear what we've been telling you from the very beginning here now for several years, is that ever since Ramaphosa has ascended to the presidency of the African National Congress and the Republic by default, the ANC has been split internally between the so-called Radical Economic Transformation faction and the Ramaphosa faction. And I don't know if there's really a Ramaphosa faction, but clearly there are enough people in South Africa that cling on to this concept that Cyril Ramaphosa is some kind of brilliant businessman. The man has no concept of business. He's walking around saying absolutely idiotic, nonsensical things like, we don't listen to business. Business doesn't rule the ANC. Well, you watch business collapse and watch what happens to your tax revenue and watch what happens to your country as it descends into chaos. Of course, prudent politicians should pay attention to business leaders. Business generates revenue. Business creates jobs. Business improves the human condition. You need business to survive. Government doesn't produce those things. So this guy, they're clinging to some sort of hope that he's some brilliant businessman. He's not a brilliant businessman. Oh yeah, he's rich, but that's because he was connected. He got patronage puppy handouts, equity stakes in companies he didn't earn. He didn't invest. And the man is basically flatlined with his wealth. If he was actually a brilliant investor or businessman, he could have quintupled, sextupled his wealth by now since 1994, but hasn't really done that, has he? So, if there were an ANC election today, Social Research Foundation says 20%. I'm not entirely convinced that's the case, but what I'm pretty confident about is the ANC would not give 40% as they did in May of last year in 2024. In my view, they're down to at least 30% or less at this point, based on what we're seeing in by-elections, based around the country, based on the behavior of their politicians. They are alienating their base. They've lost millions of voters. But it's not as if they're the only ones. The other major parties would benefit, but not significantly, according to the poll. The Democratic Alliance, the MK Party, the EFF would all gain a small number of votes. But the big winners, according to that poll, would be the outliers. The smaller parties like the Patriotic Alliance, potentially the Freedom Front Plus, maybe even the UDM, smaller parties like that, Action SA, they would gain some of these votes. But here's the bottom line. This is all speculation. There's been no vote of no confidence in Cyril Ramaphosa. Frankly, there needs to be a vote of no confidence in Cyril Ramaphosa. The country needs to wake up. But that raised the question, who comes after Cyril? Who would team up? It would be a dogfight because nobody would have more than 25% of the vote, most likely. So what's going to happen? Well, more paralysis. And this is entirely because of the system that South Africa has, in which you vote for party lists and not for candidates. So you can't toss the bums out in their ear, because the party decides who represents you, not you, the voter. And that's a shame. Whatever the case is, it is interesting fodder for conversation and discussion. The ANC, potentially at this moment, without Cyril Ramaphosa, down to 20%. Not a shocker given the way they've behaved. What say you, South Africa? What say you, world? Is the end near? Is the end nigh? Will the ANC survive? Well, no doubt the ANC will survive in some fashion. I'm not calling for the demise of the ANC just yet, but boy, the corpse is starting to rot. There's a little gangrene setting in here. Cheers, everybody.